If the end was near, what would it look like? Could it be that the hail was not random weather, but an interruption placed exactly when growth had just begun? Or could it be that the ground itself withdrew its support, opening sinkholes in places once considered safe? While people are still wondering what they mean, animals instinctively avoided the area before any danger was recognized. Objects buried deep beneath desert soil began to surface and were exposed not by destruction, but by quiet separation. Foundations all seemed to be reacting. Besides the constant updates from the media, many Americans' opinion is standing with terrible events, while others' attention shifts to motifs. What do you believe this to be? What if the answer for our big question isn't chaos overnight, but a sequence of signs, unfolding in plain sight, beginning in one nation and echoing across the globe? Before we continue our journey, hit the like and stay with us. It happened in the middle of spring, when winter had already loosened its grip. Trees were budding, fields were turning green, people had packed away coats and begun trusting the season again. Then, without warning, ice began to fall from the sky. There was no dark wall of clouds rolling in, no thunder to signal danger. The air was mild, the light familiar. And then hail struck hard pellets, slamming into roofs, shattering windshields, tearing through early crops, not built to endure cold. Gardens were shredded in minutes. Blossoms that had taken weeks to form were erased in seconds. Spring froze in place. What unsettled people most was the timing. This was not late winter clinging on. It was not a storm drifting out of season. It arrived precisely when the land had begun to open itself again, when growth had resumed, when defenses were down. The sky did not wait for heat or instability. It interrupted renewal. Meteorologists pointed to shifting patterns and unstable air, but explanations did little to calm the unease. Hail in mid-spring doesn't just destroy matter, it shatters belief in familiar order. The frightening thing isn't the falling ice, it's the feeling that once reliable cycles are losing their boundaries. In Scripture, hail is never gentle. It does not nourish. It interrupts. It arrives as a sign that something has crossed a line, that what was assumed to be safe is no longer protected by timing or season. It falls not to destroy everything, but to stop what was moving forward. So let me ask you something. When the sky breaks its pattern, what do you expect next? More storms? More noise? Or do you assume the danger is already over once the ice stops falling? Here's the part worth thinking about. What if the hail wasn't the event, but the signal? Because shortly after the ice cleared, the ground didn't crack or shake, it simply opened. Sinkholes appeared where they were never supposed to form, in places marked safe, solid, and finished. The first sinkhole did not open in a place known for collapse. It appeared in new pavement, reinforced foundations, an area engineers had marked as stable. There had been no heavy rain, no flooding, no warning signs. One moment the surface was whole, the next, it was gone. What followed made the event harder to ignore. A second sinkhole opened days later. Then another. Not scattered. Not random. They formed a straight line beneath the surface, stretching quietly across streets, lots, and open land, as if tracing a path no map had ever recorded. Before officials closed the area, before barriers were set, animals reacted. Dogs refused to walk near the openings, pulling back on leashes and freezing in place. Birds avoided the ground nearby, lifting off suddenly and not returning. Even wildlife, normally indifferent to human spaces, altered their routes, circling wide around the disturbed ground. They did not approach out of curiosity. They kept distance, as if the land itself had become untrustworthy. What unsettled residents most was the silence. There were no tremors, no cracking sounds, no visible movement before each collapse. The ground did not shake, it withdrew. And after each opening, it stopped. No spreading damage, no chain reaction, as though whatever caused it had done exactly what it came to do. Experts searched for explanations beneath the surface, but the pattern remained. Stable ground failed. The failures aligned. and living creatures sensed it before instruments did. The holes did not announce disaster. They marked something else, a line drawn quietly beneath familiar places. If the earth can open where it is not supposed to, and life instinctively knows to stay away before we do, then the question is no longer about geology. It is about warning, and whether we are still paying attention to the ground beneath our feet before it decides to pull back again. While storms strike cities and silence spreads across wildlife, something else begins to happen quietly, beneath the surface. In the American Southwest, a region long known for ancient ruins and buried history, the ground gave way to a small but troubling discovery. During routine work in a dry desert basin, a weathered wooden container was exposed just beneath hardened soil. It wasn't uncovered by a flood or a collapse. The earth simply opened enough to reveal it. Inside were beads shaped by hand, thin pieces of corroded metal, and scraps of fabric worn down by time. What stood out was not their age, but their order. The items were placed carefully. Nothing was scattered, nothing crushed. This was not debris, left behind by erosion. It looked intentional. It looked. In places like this, artifacts are not unusual. Arrowheads, tools, fragments of pottery surface every year. But this felt different. Objects lost to time are usually broken, displaced, mixed with stone and dust. This was arranged. Hidden. Not forgotten. What unsettled researchers was how untouched it seemed. The desert destroys carelessly. Heat cracks wood. Soil shifts and collapses. Yet this container held its shape, as if it had been set aside with purpose, meant to remain unseen until a later moment. Scripture often describes the earth as more than ground beneath our feet. It speaks of land that remembers, of stones that witness, of things sealed away until an appointed time. The book of Daniel speaks of knowledge being closed and hidden until the time of the end. No one claims this object holds sacred power, but its timing invites pause. As the modern world grows more unstable, violent weather, frozen regions, systems breaking down what lies beneath the surface is beginning to appear, not through destruction, but through exposure. Above ground, force and chaos. Below ground, patience and order. As if the earth has been waiting. This may be nothing more than a personal item from a forgotten culture, placed there generations ago. History is filled with such traces. Yet when the present feels fragile, the past returning feels symbolic. When the surface can no longer hold, what was buried begins to speak. And the question does not go away. Are these things rising because humanity is learning more, or because time itself no longer allows them to stay hidden? If the ground is starting to release what it once kept sealed, it leaves one uneasy thought behind: what else is still beneath us, waiting for its moment? Before we continue, please like and subscribe to support the channel. Every bit helps. Thank you. As the earth releases what it once kept hidden, attention shifts upward to a place that cannot be touched, yet refuses to be ignored. While objects surface quietly from the ground, the sky over the central United States begins to behave in ways that feel just as unsettling. On the open plains of the Midwest, people in a wide grassland preserve looked up to see something form overhead. A broad, circular ring of dark clouds appeared, hovering high above. It began to rotate slowly, even though the sky around it remained calm and clear. What made it stand out was not its size, but its control. The clouds were clearly moving, yet there was no wind at ground level. No rain, no thunder. Tall grass stood still. Birds continued flying. And yet the sky above them was turning. The formation held its shape. It didn't spread outward. It didn't collapse inward. At its center was a darker core, surrounded by lighter clouds, circling it in a steady loop. Motion existed only where the clouds were nowhere else. The contrast was disturbing. The sky felt active, while the land beneath felt frozen in place. There was no sense of immediate danger, but there was no comfort either. This wasn't how storms normally behave. It looked less like chaos and more like a system following rules people could not see. Unlike a tornado or a funnel cloud, nothing dropped toward the ground. The ring didn't widen. It didn't tear apart. It simply rotated slow, measured, contained, before gradually thinning and fading away. Because nothing was damaged, it was easy to explain away, but those who watched didn't leave. They stood still, eyes fixed upward, unsure of what they were witnessing. Weather science can describe rotating cloud patterns, shifts in air layers, temperature contrasts, local circulation. These explanations exist, and they matter. Yet standing beneath that sky, the absence of force made the moment feel wrong. Movement without pressure, rotation without violence, change without warning. Scripture often speaks of the sky not as a backdrop, but as a sign that causes people to pause. In the Gospel of Luke, signs in the heavens are mentioned alongside unrest on the earth, not as final declarations, but as moments meant to wake attention. The sky does not explain itself. It signals. First, the ground gives up what it hid. Then the sky begins to move quietly. One does not explain the other. But together, they form a pattern that feels hard to ignore. If the earth beneath our feet and the sky above our heads are both acting differently, the question becomes unavoidable. Are these simply rare natural events, or are they reminders that what we call stable may no longer be so? When the sky moves without warning, it does not shout. It waits for someone to look up. You saw what happened in the sky. The light didn't flash. It didn't drift. It stood there, fixed, silent, deliberate. And maybe you're already asking the same question many others asked that night. Was it a sign, or just something we don't understand yet? But here's the part most people miss. When something changes above us, we tend to look up and wait for answers to come from the sky. We expect thunder. We expect fire. We expect noise. What we don't expect is for the response to come from below. So let me ask you this. While everyone was watching the heavens, did you notice what was happening underfoot? Because almost at the same time that light appeared above, water began to rise where it shouldn't have, not from rivers, not from storms, from the ground itself, quietly, without warning. And that's why this matters. If the sky can open without a sound, what makes us think the earth would announce itself any differently? Stay with me, because the next event didn't fall from above. It surfaced. The flooding did not arrive the way people expected. There was no river breaking its banks, no wall of water rushing in from upstream. Instead, water began to rise from below. Storm drains overflowed. Basement floors grew slick. Water seeped through cracks in concrete and poured up through places meant to stay dry. Streets filled last. The ground filled first. What confused residents most was the water itself. It was clear, not brown, not thick with mud or debris. Streetlights reflected cleanly across its surface, giving it an unnatural shine. There was no smell of sewage, no sign of contamination. It did not look like floodwater. It looked misplaced. Then, almost as suddenly as it appeared, it began to withdraw. Within hours, sometimes less, the water receded back into the ground it had come from. It left behind no heavy silt, no ruined landscape, only damp walls, soaked foundations, and unanswered questions. The flood did not linger long enough to be studied. It came, released pressure, and disappeared. Emergency crews searched for broken mains and hidden pipelines, but found no clear source. Rainfall records did not match the volume of water. Rivers nearby remained within normal levels. There was no single point of failure to blame. The event behaved less like a flood and more like the land itself had briefly opened and then closed again. In Scripture, water is never merely a background force. It reveals, it divides, it responds. Here, it did not fall from the sky or rush in from afar. It rose quietly, cleared itself, and withdrew, leaving behind the uneasy sense that something beneath the surface had shifted, spoken, and then gone silent. The streets dried. life resumed. But the question did not fade as quickly as the water. If floods can rise without rivers, appear without warning, and vanish without trace, then what else beneath our feet might be capable of the same sudden release? Did God stop the flood in the Bible? Well, though not thoroughly mentioned, God had to be used by government in order that the flood subside to mountain altitude. The mountains are God's children, and they gave height limits to the flood legally. To stop the local universe from being overtaken by flood, God, a macro giant, had to be given of the flood to drink. Microscopic salt formations called gargoyles were introduced to his bowels by drinking. Interrogating God while he be sedated, the other Elohim spoke that he could dream. Dreaming well, God manifested as man within his thoughtful visions. He approached the gargoyle within his dream. Being that God is really a macroscopic cloud giant, the humongous gargoyle cloud giant sent electric current into God's sleeping body. From sizes unknown, the radiation began. Within his dream, the gargoyle was unable to send within his dream body. The current went first up in reflective expansion. Around God's dream body was a perfect see-through water gargoyle. The water being expanded and halted the local flood. Like an umbrella sheds water from the clouds above, the cosmic catastrophe was diverted by clear water replication. The replica gargoyle continued to expand and push the cosmic flood out. Once the electricity pushed the tributary of water out of God's sleeping body, the positive lightning shot up to form vegetation. Trees covered the earth by upward surge. The chlorophyll from the gargoyle salt filled heaven from a small dream cloud. God's dream led him to the infinite universe. Color arrived in heaven. In an instant. The foliage was colorful, and all became biologically electroplated. Second heaven is the pool and puddle that fully ends the macro expansion of the Bible flood. Basin and bad sin are comparisons in the event. Freezing a node somewhere was the cosmic government. Like a plug for a leak, the flood ended. Lightning does a lot in nature, with some crime-fighting weather fixes to help. The standing surge, Jesus used to walk on. A fugitive of hellish worlds teleported to earth in search of freedom. The giant cloud with fractal being compressed under ground salt as it arrived. Volcanoes formed from the weight on the salt sodium. Holograms were magnified above the underground volcanoes. The people that came out holographically ahead of animals were densified and downsized for local residency. A little leak still gets in from that following God unto his dream. Pumps keep that down, using radio sequences and stealth. A cube of submarine vessels of 2 layers was the first universal state. The waters were below it and drenched the cube. Emotional catastrophe filled the earth people that were mentally children then. God told the armies to submerge the cube in order to subdue the cosmic river. When it occurred is unknown. The fields and motors used resonating power to put unneeded water from submersion. Eventually, the water was pushed outside of the local space vacuum, except for a flow-through river of normal Earth capability. A whale helps the river flow through now, however the cube was still on control. The submarines are scattered in the Earth and around it in modern time. The technology actually engages cosmic radiation at a vibrational level. The field presence in the air mostly is able by deafening reflection to form magnetic functions that match the scattered cube mechanical vibrations. Matching them gives the functions over to clouds. The submarines get powered inversely by space radiation unknown. The clouds just keep allowing the motor functions to keep the water away. Deafness is displaced with also separately in cloud sections. Blindness. The light from all of the big noise is focused into submission at a water lens macro level. The Earth is used as a muffler of sound in the technological algorithm. Blocking and controlling the fountains produced by the whale are 2 walls of submarines. Some of them are stolen. One is. The worlds of Earth that were indeed flooded by the missing one would be small. Most of the leaking from the missing sub could be controlled. The smallest world would be left to their technology. A pinhole colony of people are the flooded ones. Electrical transformers would displace a cloud just like the subs and cause cosmic cloud. The function is being carried out by that little cloud universe. Right next to the transformer it is there, using cosmic radiation to remain hidden. God spoke sound at the location. The slightest cosmic vibration won't come into the universe's cloud now. God said it. People would have to work in here in now times. Submarines would need fuel in here now. The thief ditched the sub, calling it the Philadelphia experiment. God called on one that walks water of specific tone. There, that sent the radio signal to the cube for flood stop. From the point at which the Ice Age ended, there would be floods of extremely large proportions worldwide. Oddly enough, many world cultures report floods in the deep past. Imagine that. That being said, flood stories are woven into the myths, legends of many world cultures and traditions. What is written in the Torah, Talmud, the source of that which is in the collection of books called the Bible, is not the only one, and is not original. The area between the Tigris and Euphrates river systems would flood, but as well, so does the Nile, regularly. It's been theorized that the actual story of the Great Flood was either directly plagiarized from Mesopotamia, as the Semitic peoples that eventually made up the Hebrews extensively traveled, traded, interacted socially and philosophically with societies in Mesopotamia, or that it relates to stories older than the Epic of Gilgamesh that either have been lost or we just haven't found yet. The flood itself could be related to flooding in the Tigris and Euphrates area, or could actually be related to the flooding of the Black Sea, as in the link above. Sacred texts, or religious literature, is never a solid nor dependable historical reference, and it's been shown time and again that if it is thought to be so, there ends up being little, if any, archaeological evidence to support. What does the Great Flood represent? To my mind, the flood is another excellent example of the meta-narrative of Genesis. As I mention in David Moore's answer to "What are the reasons why the book of Genesis in the Bible was the most misunderstood portion of the Bible?" The creation stories are myths of the best kind, explanations for why things are the way they are, which appeal partly to the empirical and partly to the ideal and the metaphysical. All our knowledge consists of such conflations. My favorite examples are found in the sciences with which I am somewhat familiar. We endow matter and energy with a mind. We can hardly avoid it. Various systems interact in a manner that takes on intentionality. Remember, in what way is any cell trying to survive? In what way does a protein have a purpose? In a godless world, there is no reason for life to be any different from non-life. All is equal in stochastic thermodynamics. So, why is it that we see sense in concepts such as pathology and physiology? What, again, distinguishes them? Does pathos exist? Really? Do tissues feel terror? Do cells suffer? If not, then we do not. Human consciousness is the meta-narrative to the world of physical consequence, and this is the sort of logical space that Genesis occupies. It gives reasons for the way things are. Those reasons are simplifications designed to convey certain aspects of significance at the expense of others. That's reality, really. So, why a flood? Why the death? Why the destruction? Firstly, I believe an actual deluge occurred. I am unsure of the scale. Australia is on fire right now. That statement is both true and false. Whole areas are untouched. Similarly, an ancient set of authors knew a smaller world, and it is conceivable to me that the entire Mediterranean rim beneath the Black Sea may have been affected. Many survivors of events on a global scale describe such scenarios as the end of the world. This is because our world is the area we have associations with. No one has ever seen the whole. However, here we are talking about a machine language level problem. What matters is the significance the occurrence takes on to the people that the story becomes part of. Like family legacies, Genesis is a work that establishes identity, both a tribal one and a more general type. When we consider the intentionality expressed in the flood myth, we are faced with a discomforting premise: a God that desires the destruction of his creation. The creation has become corrupted. How? Why? Let's look at the justification for the flood. Here it is. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. So, the Lord said, "I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I have made them." Genesis 6:5-7. NIV. The regret of God. Disproof of omniscience, right? Only in the sense that the freedom allowed to the world allows its divergence from his image. One might say we control our own bodies, but if this is the case, then why does malignancy occur? The truth is not so simple, and this is an example of simplification that makes the mind of God relatable, in exactly the sort of false way that these words represent my mentality to you. We cannot be each other. We can only imagine what it might be like in our own terms. So, in Genesis 6 we see a rejection of creation according to accumulated error, and a literal turnover of the earth by a liquid that both eliminates life and engenders it. Some might consider such a metaphorical view inflammatory for other reasons, but that is my point. Just like words take on different meanings and functions in context, so too do events and their analyses serve different ends in different times. I believe a flood occurred. I believe God is responsible. I believe the Bible communicates aspects of that instance as information that is effective. However, I also believe that my perspective of such processes approximates, by analogy, a cell's as it interprets cytokines. Furthermore, just as a fractal presents self-similarity at different scales, so some of the patterns implicit in the divine purpose can be perceived even in our own imperfect and perpetually inflamed persons. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, and keep an eye out for our next video. Leave a comment, and let us know what you think. What is happening to America when none of this is happening alone?
It's another frigid day for millions as we brace for another snowstorm here on the East Coast.
Cars nearby are encased in ice after a pipe reportedly burst.
The CHP tells us it was all caused by a familiar danger for anyone who's made that drive north through the Central Valley. Dense fog made for very low visibility.
Winter no longer brings silence. It brings thick fog across California, reducing highway visibility to near zero and triggering consequences that follow as a matter of course. And it seemed to mark the moment when everything that had felt normal suddenly no longer did. Rivers surged past their limits without warning. Solid ground caved in, swallowing roads and homes as if they were never there. And above it all, the sky shifted. Unnatural sounds, deep trumpet-like roll through the air, stopping people cold. What was happening was easy to see, but far harder for anyone to truly understand why. The Bible speaks to this kind of moment. There are times described when people see, yet do not fully perceive, when events unfold plainly before them, but understanding lags behind experience. The question now is not what everyone noticed, but why now? Why didn't it raise concern at first? If you're trying to understand what's unfolding, like and subscribe before we break down each event in detail. Across parts of California, a different kind of unease spread quietly this winter. It didn't arrive with sirens or storms. Instead, a video spreading rapidly overnight showed California's Central Valley nearly disappearing beneath a dense winter fog. On Highway 99, familiar stretches of road faded from view in minutes. Headlights dissolved into glare. Taillights vanished without warning. What drivers relied on for distance and direction simply ceased to exist. It left many people uneasy when they realized how suddenly normal movement had stopped. Highway 99 is one of California's most critical transportation corridors, carrying commuters, freight, and emergency vehicles every single day. When the fog settled in, traffic slowed to a crawl almost instantly. In some areas, it stopped altogether. By early morning, the region was wrapped in a heavy, silent whiteout. Visibility dropped to near zero, for miles at a time. Drivers were forced to abandon vehicles along shoulders. Emergency responders moved cautiously, guided more by sound than sight. Pileups were reported as cars entered the fog, unaware of what lay ahead. Hundreds of vehicles became trapped in place. Road travel was severely disrupted, and reports confirmed serious accidents caused by the sudden loss of visibility. Dozens of cars and trucks were involved in the accident, forcing Freeway 99 closed and causing major traffic disruption. These were not just delays or inconveniences. Lives were affected. Families waited for news. Anxiety spread through communities that depend on this highway every day. Weather experts described the event as a classic winter fog episode, intensified by cold air trapped beneath warmer layers above. They noted that changing climate patterns are increasing the frequency and severity of these conditions, overwhelming road systems designed for clearer winters. Yet, as footage showed long stretches of highway swallowed by whiteness, many were reminded of ancient warnings found in Scripture. In the book of Isaiah, there is a description of a people moving forward while unable to see their path. We grope along the wall like the blind. We stumble at noon, as if it were twilight. The image is not about nightfall, but about daylight without clarity, motion without vision. Winter is meant to bring stillness and definition, yet here it brought blindness instead. The prophets often describe such moments not as punishment, but as testing times, when familiar ways disappear, forcing people to slow down and question direction rather than rush ahead out of habit. As fog continued to cling to the highway and daylight failed to clear it, one question lingered beneath the surface. Is this an isolated incident, or the beginning of something far more unsettling? Winter has not loosened its grip, and new signs continue to surface through sinkholes and landslides. In several areas that appeared calm and untouched by the worst of the season, residents began to relax. There were no blizzards, no howling winds, no frozen highways, no scenes of chaos. Daily life seemed normal. Many believed the danger had passed. It was within that calm that disaster arrived quietly and without warning. There was no explosion, no alarm, no visible signal of threat. The ground itself, long trusted as solid, dependable, and permanent, suddenly collapsed beneath them. In moments, familiar streets vanished. Houses were pulled downward. Cars slipped into darkness, as if they had never existed. Massive sinkholes opened without notice, carving deep scars into the earth. Beneath them was a vast emptiness, dark, unstable, and impossible to fully comprehend. People gathered at a distance, stunned into silence, trying to grasp that only minutes earlier the same place had been a home, a road, a path to safety. What made these events so disturbing was not only the destruction, but the total absence of warning. Unlike storms or earthquakes, which often give signs, sinkholes strike suddenly and without mercy. They stand as a stark reminder that humanity does not truly control the ground beneath its feet. At the same time, coastal regions have experienced landslides with increasing force. Cliffs, slowly worn by the ocean for decades, suddenly gave way. Large sections of land dropped into the sea, carrying trees, buildings, and history with them. Specialists point to heavy rain, shifting climate patterns, and weakened rock layers below the surface. From a scientific perspective, These explanations are reasonable. Yet for many people of faith, a deeper question remains. Why are these events happening so often, so abruptly, and so close together in time? Scripture has long warned that in the final days, even what seems secure will be shaken. Isaiah 24 speaks of the foundations of the earth being disturbed. Psalm 18 describes the earth quaking and the mountains trembling. Today's sinkholes and landslides cause many to recall these ancient words not to incite fear, but to awaken awareness. They point to a truth often overlooked. Lasting security does not come from buildings, possessions, or human systems, but from a firm foundation in God. When the ground beneath us can disappear without warning, we are forced to examine where our confidence truly lies, whether in wealth, stability, and control, or in the Creator, who alone cannot be shaken. These events serve as a call to humility, vigilance, and spiritual readiness, not only to prepare our homes and communities, but to prepare our inner lives. For if even the earth can fail, then God alone remains a refuge. Before we continue, let us pause for a brief prayer. May God grant us clarity, wisdom, and calm hearts as we reflect on what we are witnessing. As the afternoon faded into evening, an unusual sound rolled through the air across parts of the United States. It was not sharp, not explosive, but deep, prolonged, and resonant, echoing like a low trumpet carried on the wind. The sky itself seemed to vibrate as the sound passed overhead, lingering longer than thunder and lacking any clear direction. At first, people paused, unsure how to describe what they were hearing. It did not resemble aircraft. It did not follow the rhythm of machinery. The sound rose, fell, then returned again, slow, heavy, and unmistakably present. Windows rattled faintly. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Phones were lifted, not to record, but to check whether anyone else was hearing the same thing. Then came the reaction. Birds that had been resting on power lines and rooftops suddenly lifted into the air. Their flight was uneven and erratic, breaking formation as they scattered across the sky. They circled briefly, then disappeared, leaving the space above strangely empty. The animals seemed to respond not to sight, but to something felt rather than seen. The sound did not fade quickly. It lingered, pulsing through the atmosphere, as if moving through layers of air rather than across the ground. Some described it as coming from everywhere at once. Others said it felt closer to vibration than noise. Online, explanations began to circulate. Some pointed to military activity or distant aircraft. Others mentioned atmospheric conditions or rare acoustic effects. Yet none of these explanations fully matched the timing, depth, or persistence of what people heard. And many asked the same quiet question: why did it happen here, and why now? In moments like this, science can explain parts of what we observe, but not always the way it feels. That gap between explanation and experience is where unease grows. In Scripture, sound carried through the air is often described as a signal rather than an accident. Trumpet-like sounds are not portrayed as background noise, but as calls to attention moments meant to interrupt routine and awaken awareness. The meaning is not fear, but recognition. Ezekiel continues that thought. The fish in the sea, the birds in the sky, the beasts of the field, every creature that moves along the ground, and all the people on the face of the earth will tremble at my presence. When the sound finally faded, it left behind more than silence. It left a sense that something had passed through, unseen, unfixed, and unanswered. And the question that lingered was not whether the sound could be explained, but whether it was meant to be noticed at all. As the sky began to shift, people lifted their eyes in fear. Attention slowly shifted northward, toward waters long considered distant and untouched. What followed was quieter than floods or collapsing ground, but no less unsettling. Along remote stretches of Alaska's coastline, dark, oil-like material began appearing on icy shores, thick, tarry, unmistakably black against snow and frozen rock. There were no tankers in distress, no drilling platforms nearby, no industrial accidents reported. Authorities confirmed there were no modern oil spills to explain what was surfacing. At first, the material appeared in small patches, scattered and easily overlooked. But as reports increased, the pattern became harder to ignore. The substance was not spreading from a single source. It was emerging at multiple points along the coast, as if pushed upward rather than spilled outward. Scientists examining the phenomenon emphasized one critical detail. This was not new material. It had not been recently produced or released by human activity. Instead, evidence pointed downward. Beneath Alaska's coastal waters lie vast layers of ancient organic matter, buried deep beneath sediment, rock, and frozen ground. Some of these deposits date back thousands of years, sealed under pressure since long before modern history. Researchers believe shifts beneath the seafloor caused by changing pressure, thawing permafrost, and subtle ground movement have fractured those ancient layers. What had remained locked away for centuries was now being forced to the surface. This was not creation, it was exposure. What made the discovery especially troubling was its timing. It did not arrive in isolation. It followed reports of ground instability, collapsing foundations, and changing conditions elsewhere. The land was not simply reacting at the surface. It appeared to be releasing what it had long contained. For many observers, the question was not whether the substance posed immediate danger, but what it represented. Ancient, sealed matter does not surface without cause. Pressure builds quietly over time. Release comes only when restraint fails. Scripture often describes such moments not as accidents, but as unveilings. In the book of Job, it is written, "He uncovers the deeps out of darkness and brings deep darkness to light." The emphasis is not on destruction, but revelation. What was hidden does not remain hidden forever. The appearance of oil-like residue along Alaska's frozen coast has led many to ask a deeper question, one that science alone does not answer. Why now? Why are substances buried, since ancient times emerging at this moment, alongside so many other signs of instability? When the earth begins to give up what it has long held, it forces a reckoning, not only with the land beneath our feet, but with the assumption that what is sealed will always remain so. The concern is not only what has surfaced, but what else may still be waiting below. For the moment, restraint finally gives way. As attention remained fixed on what was rising along distant coastlines, another discovery was unfolding quietly beneath Florida, hidden not by water or ice, but by the ground itself. For decades, maps and surveys suggested that the underground cave systems beneath the state were limited, fragmented, and well understood. That assumption is now collapsing. Beneath neighborhoods, roads, and protected land, vast empty chambers have been discovered, spaces far larger and deeper than anything previously recorded. What makes these caverns unsettling is not only their size, but how long they remained unseen. They were not uncovered by advanced scanning. They were not revealed by exploration or drilling. They came to light only when the ground above them could no longer hold. In several areas, the surface failed without warning. Streets cracked, land sank, and as it did, openings appeared, exposing hollow worlds beneath. These chambers were not newly formed. Geological analysis confirms they have existed for thousands of years, slowly carved by water moving through limestone, sealed beneath layers of earth, while life continued above, unaware. This was not a discovery made by human effort. It was exposure, forced by collapse. What lies beneath Florida has always been there, quietly bearing weight, supporting cities, highways, and generations of development. Over time, erosion and shifting pressure weakened the ceilings of these hidden spaces. When balance finally gave way, the underground was revealed not because it was sought, but because concealment failed. What troubles experts is not simply that these caves exist, but how extensive they are. Old maps no longer apply. Known boundaries no longer hold. The ground beneath what appeared stable is far more fragile and far more complex than once believed. The land did not announce this change. It revealed it only when failure made silence impossible. For many people of faith, this pattern feels familiar. Scripture repeatedly teaches that what is hidden does not remain hidden forever. In the book of Daniel, it is written, "He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what lies in darkness." The emphasis is not on human discovery, but on revelation, truths emerging when the time arrives. Job echoes this theme, stating that the earth itself gives up what it has long concealed. The message is consistent. Concealment is temporary. Exposure comes when pressure reaches its limit. What is happening beneath Florida is more than a geological adjustment. It is a reminder. Entire worlds can exist below the surface, unseen, until the moment they are forced into view. When the ground itself begins to uncover what it once protected, the question shifts from what was hidden to why it is being revealed now. And if structures buried for thousands of years are emerging only because the surface can no longer contain them, it leaves one thought difficult to ignore: how much more lies beneath, waiting for the moment when concealment is no longer possible. As attention shifted from what was being exposed beneath the surface in Florida, another phenomenon began to emerge farther inland. One that unsettled witnesses not because of violence, but because of restraint. In Colorado, reports did not describe collapse, rupture, or destruction. There was no violent shaking, no cracking ground, no landslides or sudden failure. What witnesses observed was far quieter and far more difficult to explain. Across different locations and elevations, individuals reported the ground rising and settling in a slow, even rhythm. Not once, not twice, but repeatedly. The motion was gentle, measured, and consistent, as if the land itself were adjusting. Those who stood on it said it did not feel chaotic, it felt deliberate. Many struggled to find words. Again and again, the same description appeared. It was like breathing. The ground did not break apart. It did not give way beneath weight. Instead, it lifted slightly, then released. Over and over, steady enough to be felt, subtle enough to escape immediate alarm. What made the reports difficult to dismiss was their consistency. Witnesses, unfamiliar with one another, standing miles apart, described the same sensation with the same language. Equally unsettling was what did not accompany the movement. There were no earthquakes recorded, no seismic alerts, no volcanic activity. Instruments that typically explain motion at that scale showed nothing abnormal. Geologists suggested possibilities: pressure redistribution, groundwater shifts, slow crustal adjustment, but even they acknowledged the irregularity. The movement was too smooth, too synchronized, too controlled. In Scripture, mountains are often portrayed as symbols of permanence, what humans assume will never move. Yet the Bible also records moments when mountains respond, not with collapse, but with reaction. The prophet Nahum writes that the mountains tremble before him, and the hills melt. The language is not of destruction, but of response creation, reacting to a greater presence. The Psalms echo this imagery, describing hills moving not in chaos, but in awareness. The emphasis is not on breaking apart, but on motion with purpose. Even Habakkuk speaks of God standing, measuring the earth, and only then do the mountains move. Measurement precedes change. What people are witnessing in Colorado does not resemble disaster. It resembles preparation, not an ending, but an adjustment. Not a collapse, but a loosening. Not violence, but readiness. When even the most stable parts of the landscape refuse to remain completely still, it challenges a deep assumption that everything beneath us is settled, fixed, and finished. If mountains long regarded as immovable can shift quietly without warning, Scripture suggests this is not random. It is a signal, and it leaves behind a question that grows harder to ignore. What kind of season are we living in, when the land itself appears to be preparing for something yet to come? Near Cedar Creek Lake in East Texas, an unusual sight, quietly unsettled residents. Behind rows of lakeside homes, a narrow tornado formed without warning, thin as a cord, rising straight from the ground into low-hanging clouds. It looked less like a violent funnel, and more like a line drawn upward, as if linking Earth to the sky above. What made people stop and stare was not its speed, but its behavior. The tornado moved slowly, almost deliberately. This region is no stranger to severe weather, yet many who watched felt immediately that this was different. Something about its shape and motion did not match what they had seen before. It appeared fragile, almost delicate, yet deeply unsettling. A slender column turning quietly against the calm suburban sky, creating a contrast that was hard to ignore. Despite its narrow form, the damage it left behind was undeniable. Large trees were torn from the ground. Roofs were peeled back. Several homes suffered significant damage, consistent with a lower-end tornado. The destruction was limited in scope, but strong enough to leave an impression that lingered longer than the storm itself. Meteorologists were quick to respond. They explained that the tornado formed from unstable atmospheric conditions, contrasting temperatures and pressure systems, generating rotation. By classification, it was not extraordinary. Yet the length, thin structure, and slow movement continued to trouble those who witnessed it firsthand. As questions spread, some turned to older texts, not for explanation, but for perspective. In the book of Job, storms are described as forces that move with intention beyond human control. He makes the clouds his chariot and rides on the wings of the wind. Job 37. The passage does not frame storms as random accidents, but as reminders of how limited human understanding truly is. The prophet Jeremiah also speaks of a time when the natural order feels unsettled, when signs appear not to terrify, but to awaken awareness. And in Amos, the shaking of land and sky is portrayed as a moment meant to interrupt complacency, not simply to destroy. From that perspective, the tornado at Cedar Creek Lake becomes more than a weather event. It becomes a moment that unsettles routine, a reminder that what feels stable can be disturbed quietly, suddenly, and without announcement. When the thin funnel finally unraveled and disappeared back into the clouds, the sky returned to its calm appearance. But the feeling it left behind did not fade as quickly. If such moments are not meant to signal chaos, then perhaps they exist to prompt reflection. Not about fear, but about readiness. Not about panic, but about attention. And the question that lingered was not what caused the tornado, but what it was calling people to notice before the skies grow quiet again. The morning at Yellowstone did not begin with fire in the sky, but with movement beneath the ground. Steam vents intensified without warning. Geysers that normally followed predictable intervals began erupting out of sequence. Plumes of hot water and vapor shot higher than usual, hanging in the cold air like signals rather than scenery. The shift was sudden. What had been a calm landscape of snow-dusted ground and quiet boardwalks transformed into an area charged with tension. The earth trembled lightly, not enough to cause panic, but enough to be felt. Pools near thermal basins churned more violently, their colors darkening as heat surged upward. Ash did not fall here, but the air itself changed. Sulfurous steam drifted across nearby roads and trails, reducing visibility and forcing closures within the park. Rangers moved quickly to clear visitors from sensitive zones as activity spread across multiple geothermal sites at once. The sense of scale grew rapidly. This was not a single vent reacting, but a system responding together. A normal morning gave way to urgent decisions. Access points were shut down. Safety warnings were issued. Scientists monitored pressure changes beneath the caldera, watching for signs of escalating instability. Instruments recorded increased heat flow and subtle ground deformation signals that something deeper was shifting. Geologists explained the mechanics. Rising magma pressure, combined with tectonic stress, can force heat and gases upward through Yellowstone's vast underground network. Such activity does not always lead to eruption, but it carries long-term risks. Ground collapse, toxic gas release, and irreversible damage to surrounding ecosystems and communities. In moments like this, ancient words often return not as explanations, but as perspective. In the book of Isaiah, the earth is described as reacting when its foundations are disturbed. The earth trembles and shakes. It staggers like a hut. Isaiah 24. The passage is not focused on spectacle, but on instability, on what happens when what seemed immovable begins to shift. The book of Job speaks even more directly to forces beneath the surface, describing fire and heat hidden within the earth, beyond human reach or control. These texts frame such moments not as chaos, but as reminders of limits of how little command humanity truly has over the ground it stands upon. From that perspective, Yellowstone is not merely a park or a destination. It is a reminder of restrained power of forces held in balance, not by human design, but by conditions that can change. As steam continued to rise and the ground slowly settled, one question lingered in the quiet that followed. When the earth itself shows signs of unrest, do we treat it as background noise, or as a moment calling for attention before something far greater is released? Jesus had warned that a time would come when the world would feel unfamiliar, not because it had ended, but because its order had begun to strain. His words were not framed as fear-driven predictions, but as signs meant to be recognized. In the Gospels, Jesus speaks of days when the earth and sky would no longer behave as expected, when creation itself would respond in ways that disrupt routine and certainty. He warned that there would be signs in the heavens and distress among nations, not isolated events, but pressures arriving together. The warning was not about curiosity or spectacle. It was about awareness. Jesus described moments when people would carry on with ordinary life, unaware that deeper forces were moving beneath the surface. The danger, he said, was not the signs themselves, but the blindness that causes people to ignore them. Throughout Scripture, disruption is often used as a form of revelation. When boundaries fail and foundations shift, it exposes where trust has been misplaced. Jesus echoed this theme when he spoke of houses built on sand and rock. The storm does not create weakness, it reveals it. When the storm comes, only what is firmly grounded remains standing. Jesus also warned that these signs would not come with clarity or comfort. He said, confusion would spread, hearts would grow heavy, and fear would rise because the familiar rhythms of life would no longer hold. Yet he did not speak these words to terrify. He spoke them to prepare. He told his followers to watch, not panic, to discern, not dismiss. In the book of Luke, Jesus makes it clear that the signs are not random. They are signals. When creation reacts, it is not acting independently, but responding within limits set by God. Scripture consistently shows that the natural world reflects spiritual realities. When restraint weakens in one, it echoes in the other. Revelation expands on this warning through imagery of trumpets and shaking foundations. These are not symbols of entertainment or myth. They represent moments when God interrupts human self-assurance. The trumpet in Scripture is a call to attention, a line drawn between indifference and response. It demands awareness before judgment, reflection before consequence. Jesus warned that many would see these signs and still continue as before. Life would go on, commerce would continue, distractions would multiply. And yet, he said, those who understand would recognize the season, not the date, but the meaning, not the hour, but the direction. The central message of Jesus' warning is not destruction, but decision. Signs are not given to predict timelines, but to expose hearts. They ask where confidence truly rests. In systems, in stability, or in God alone. Jesus ended his warning with a call to posture, not fear. When these things begin to happen, he said, "Lift your heads." Not because the world is ending, but because accountability and redemption are drawing near. The warning remains now, pressing every generation to choose attentiveness over denial. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and keep an eye out for our next video. Leave a comment and let us know what you think.
This morning, a state of emergency across California as massive amounts of rain drench the West.
They're going somewhere.
2 minutes ago, something shifted beneath the United States. In normally stable regions, the ground is splitting and cutting through farmland with no storms, no earthquakes, or warning. Above it, flocks of birds suddenly turn back mid-flight, moving in perfect unison as if responding to something unseen. Then the earth itself begins to fail. Sinkholes open beneath Pennsylvania neighborhoods, where families had felt secure for decades, forcing them to evacuate without tremors or warning. Now even the rivers are changing white foam, stretching for miles as fish rise silently. These events are not isolated. They are arriving together. And the question is no longer if something is unfolding, but why it is happening now. If you're willing to look beyond the surface and connect what others overlook, like, subscribe, and stay with us. In recent weeks, unusual changes have been reported along parts of the California. Residents began noticing long, straight cracks appearing across hardened ground, clean lines cutting through open land. These cracks were not jagged or chaotic. They appeared as clean lines, running parallel for hundreds of meters, dividing fields and empty lots with unsettling precision. What made these fissures disturbing was not just where they appeared, but their timing. They did not follow known fault lines. There were no earthquakes recorded overnight, no storms, no flooding. In several cases, tire tracks and footprints from the previous day ended abruptly at the edge of a new crack, as if the land had shifted quietly while everything else slept. Unlike drought-related cracks that branch and curl as moisture evaporates unevenly, these lines advanced forward, straight and deliberate. Local officials and geologists offered familiar explanations: long-term groundwater depletion, subsidence, gradual pressure building beneath the surface. The processes were known. The language was technical, yet the timing remained difficult to account for. Similar cracks are appearing across regions with different soil compositions and climates. People living near these areas described a shared response. There was no panic, no crowds. Often, it was just one or two individuals stopping their cars, stepping out, and standing silently for several minutes. The ground did not look violently damaged. It looked altered, separated, as if something below had shifted without warning or sound. Scripture often uses this image when speaking of warning and exposure. Collapse rarely begins with noise. Foundations weaken first. They separate before they fall. The prophet Isaiah warned of a land breaking apart quietly, writing, "The earth is utterly broken. The earth is split apart. The earth is violently shaken." Yet before the violent shaking comes separation, what appears firm begins to give way beneath the surface. That is why these fractures feel different from ordinary geological events. They are not disasters. They have not destroyed homes or taken lives. Instead, they reveal change. They show that something once whole is no longer unified. The question, then, is not whether the ground can crack. That has always happened. The deeper question is why this kind of precise separation is appearing now quietly, across multiple regions, without a dramatic trigger, and whether the division visible in the land reflects an instability that has already begun beneath the surface, waiting to be noticed. As the ground below continued to separate in silence, another disturbance appeared overhead. Along parts of the Los Angeles and into western San Francisco, people began reporting flocks of birds abruptly changing direction mid-flight. The shift was sudden, nearly a full reversal, and it happened in unison. The birds did not scatter or cry out. They stayed tightly grouped, turning together as if responding to something ahead that could not be seen. There were no storm systems developing offshore. The sky was pale and open, broken only by thin streaks of cloud. Commercial flights moved steadily across the horizon. Nothing visible explained why entire flocks would abandon their course at the same instant. People watching from the grounds described a quiet discomfort, not fear, but a sense that something was off. The sky looked ordinary, yet the movement within it was not. The moment felt linked to what had already been unfolding below. The land had not broken apart with force. It had separated quietly, almost carefully. Now, the birds did not flee in confusion. They simply turned away. Yet the change was unmistakable. In the Bible, animals are often shown responding before humans understand what is coming. In the Old Testament, the prophet Jeremiah observed that even animals recognize approaching change sooner than people do. Even the stork in the heavens knows her appointed times, and the turtle-dove swallow and crane keep the time of their coming. But my people know not the judgment of the Lord. Jeremiah 8-7. Instinct, Scripture suggests, can perceive shifts that reason ignores. In the days of Noah, Scripture says the animals entered the ark on their own. Noah did not drive them in. They arrived when the time was right. Creation moved first, before judgment was fully revealed. This pattern appears more than once in Scripture. Nature senses change before people recognize danger. Job speaks of this same awareness embedded within creation itself. But ask the beasts, and they will teach you, the birds of the heavens, and they will tell you. Job 12-7. That is what makes these sightings difficult to dismiss. Birds do not waste energy without cause. They follow instinct shaped over countless generations. When that instinct overrides direction and destination under calm conditions, it suggests awareness beyond human perception. The question is not whether birds can behave strangely. The deeper question is why these reversals are happening now, across multiple states, beneath quiet skies. What did the birds sense in the air, or beyond it, that people could not detect? And if creation is responding early, what does that suggest about what may still be approaching, unseen, but already in motion? As the land continued to show signs of separation, another disturbance followed, this time directly beneath where people lived. In central Pennsylvania, a massive sinkhole opened inside a quiet residential neighborhood. The collapse began without warning. Within minutes, the earth opened and widened rapidly, swallowing yards and pulling pavement inward. There were no hurricanes passing through, no heavy rain, no seismic alerts. Yet the ground failed beneath homes where families had lived for generations. Residents described standing at a distance, hearing the low, muffled sound. Sidewalks split, driveways tilted, walls cracked and leaned before slipping out of sight. There was no explosion, no violent jolt, only the slow, irreversible understanding that the ground could no longer support what had been placed upon it. At nearly the same time, similar changes were unfolding in southern Utah and parts of Nevada. Slopes did not collapse in dramatic landslides. Instead, the land began to settle unevenly. Entire sections of ground descended inch by inch, damaging homes, water lines, and power infrastructure. Families were asked to leave quietly, often after dark, carrying only essential belongings, without clear explanations or visible triggers. What made these events especially unsettling was where they occurred. Several collapses appeared near mapped fault zones, yet seismic instruments recorded no earthquakes. Witnesses described the feeling as movement without impact, as if the ground had given up silently beneath them. Not a quake, not a tremor, but a quiet displacement. In Scripture, the earth is not portrayed as inert when judgment or warning approaches. The book of Numbers records a moment when the ground opened without storm or shaking. The ground under them split apart. The earth opened its mouth and swallowed them. Numbers 16:31-32. There was no battle, no thunder, only sudden separation beneath those standing above it. The psalmist later describes collapse not as noise, but as loss of support. When the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? Psalm 11:3. The verse assumes that the failure begins below. Likewise, Isaiah speaks of land giving way under accumulated weight. The earth staggers like a drunkard, for its transgression lies heavy upon it. Isaiah 24:20. The burden builds quietly until the ground can no longer hold. Even Job frames this awareness as something creation itself understands. He shakes the earth out of its place, and its pillars tremble. Job 9-6. The pillars do not always fall at once. They loosen first. That is why these events feel different. They are not sudden disasters. They are exposures. The land is not crying out. It is yielding quietly, as if responding to a pressure long ignored. The question is no longer why the ground can collapse. Nature has always done that. The deeper question is why it is happening now, across multiple states, without warning and without sound, and whether this silent shifting beneath our feet is pointing to something else that has already begun to give way, unseen, below the surface. After the land began to split, and the ground gave way without sound, another quiet shift followed, this time in the water. Along portions of the Ohio River Valley, the upper Mississippi Basin, and stretches of the Missouri River, residents began noticing changes that did not fit familiar seasonal patterns. Rivers that had flowed steadily for decades began to look unsettled without appearing violent. Thick bands of white foam collected along the surface, clinging to bends and shorelines, stretching uninterrupted for miles. There were no nearby factories releasing visible waste, no upstream flooding reported, no sharp chemical odor rising from the water. The air smelled ordinary. The current moved at its usual pace, yet the rivers no longer looked clean. The foam lingered dense, chalky, slow to break apart, drifting downstream, but refusing to dissolve the way surface froth normally does. Water samples were taken. Routine explanations followed. Runoff, organic matter, turbulence. None fully accounted for the scale or persistence of what people were seeing. What should have dispersed within hours remained for days. What should have passed unnoticed began drawing quiet crowds, anglers standing longer than usual, farmers stopping along bridges, people watching the surface in silence. Then came the fish. In several locations, freshwater fish were seen rising toward the surface in unusual numbers. They were not floating lifeless. They were not thrashing or gasping. Instead, they hovered just beneath the waterline, suspended in stillness, their bodies barely moving, as if waiting. After a time, they slipped back below the surface, leaving no clear explanation behind. For those watching, the scene was unsettling precisely because it lacked spectacle. There was no mass die-off, no emergency response, no visible catastrophe, just a quiet interruption of normal behavior. Rivers that should have flowed unnoticed now seemed to hesitate. The pattern felt connected to what had already unfolded on land.